in the vast stillness of the Egyptian desert, beyond the reach of the Nile's forgiving waters. There once rose a city veiled in golden dust and silence, Nekeb. Its name was stricken from most records, not by accident or decay, but by decree. And from these remnants, stitched together by scholars and madmen alike, emerges a ritual, a festival that celebrated not life, but the conscious surrender to death. For what transpired there, what was worse ebbed, whispered, and finally, buried beneath sandstone in centuries, was so dreadful that even the pharaohs dared not speak of it. To the world, Setepi was a man of immaculate piety, his hands, the ones that anointed the dying with cedar oil and stars, but behind the alabaster mask of divinity, Setepi was a man torn in two between the terrifying love for his people and the unbearable burden of the covenant. His bloodline had sworn for generations, but beneath the perfumed veils and gold-threaded robes, there breathed something older than gods. It was not a celebration, it was a sacrifice. She had grown within temple walls, schooled in chants and stars, never once complaining of solitude. She believed in the gods with a fierceness even Setepi had lost. She believed, most cruelly, that her father would never let harm come to her. The vessel must be uncracked, they said. The gods do not drink from cups filled with regret. Every full moon, he would awaken drenched in sweat, his fingers curled into claws, lips mumbling the names of the buried. He had seen them, and the oracle of dust, buried knee-deep in char and bone, whispered in three tongues. The flower must be buried with its root. Not even Setepi, who had overseen the burial rites of 3 cycles. He, who had led young souls, trembling and crowned in myrrh, into the belly of the earth. She was radiant, draped in white linen, threaded with lapis. Around her neck, she wore a scarab carved from black onyx, the token of renewal. No, Father, but I pity you, not as corpses, but as wanderers in a twilight world, eyes open, mouths sealed with resin and regret. She was fed only figs, water laced with lotus, and her skin was anointed with oils that would preserve her flesh even in the suffocating dark. Her laughter grew quieter, her sleep deeper, yet her eyes never lost faith. If the gods have chosen me, she whispered to Setepi through the stone grill, then I am already with them. Do not fear. They called to him not in hatred, but longing, and yet, every 100 years, the wind uncovers a shard of memory, a fragment of obsidian tablet, a fresco too stubborn to fade. He imagined her breath in the dark, counting minutes, hours, years, under tons of limestone. Would she dream? Would she scream? They called it the Festival of the Second Dawn. To outsiders, it resembled no more than a sacred procession, a civic rite of renewal. The gods, once warm, familiar presences, had turned their faces. Were they truly pleased, or was this just a cycle of cruelty masquerading as faith? Our story begins with Setepi, the high priest of Nekeb during the reign of Pharaoh Nefer. Every 100 years, at the closing of the flood season, Nekeb would select the most the purest soul among them, not to kill, no, but to entomb alive beneath the temple of the west wind, alongside their ancestors, as an offering for balance. Life for continued life. Breath for the breath of crops. A soul, so that the city may have its sun. You see, Setepi bore a mark not visible to the eye, but etched into his dreams. For the second, dawn was not a metaphor. It was a promise. But this time, Setepi's heart faltered. For the chosen one was Niari, his own daughter. She was barely 17, with eyes like carved topaz and a voice that could soothe an ox into sleep. But the omens were clear. The ibis flew backward across the sun. The sycamores wept blood-red sap. The council wept when the name was spoken. Some protested. One Eldamero, the blind, threw himself into the Nile that very night, but none could defy the law. Still, he tried. In secret, he offered his own life, his own body, in place of hers. But the priests refused. So preparations began. For 40 days, Niari was cloistered within the Hall of Silence. But Setepi feared more than death. He feared doubt. For the first time in his life, the sacred texts felt like riddles. He stood each night beside the burial chamber, chiseling runes, blessing stones, hiding tears in the folds of his robe. The night before the ritual, Setepi entered her cell one last time. "Do you hate me?" he asked. She looked up and smiled. The sun rose slow that morning, as if reluctant to cast its light upon what would unfold. A dense fog of incense hung over Nekeb, thick with myrrh and burnt juniper. The entire city had gathered at the steps of the Temple of the West, when a ziggurat, carved with serpentine relief, each coil depicting a soul buried alive in divine offering. For the people of Nekeb, this was not mourning. Around her, the people chanted the hymn of the second dawn, voices rising and falling, like the wind sweeping across tombstones. No one looked her in the eyes, not even the children. To those gathered, he was the beacon of resolve. But inside, he was already buried alive in a different way. Every syllable he uttered was like swallowing thorns. She would not be embalmed. The gods demanded her warm. Her beating heart was the spark they required to reignite the sacred flame. For hours, perhaps days. The walls had no hieroglyphs, no decorations, just stone, and silence. And slowly, the torch would die. And with it, her name from the world above. Let the flesh return to the dust that made it. Let the breath rise into the lungs of the harvest. Let the soul climb the ladder of the night and become the sun's first tear. It was duty adorned in silk, faces painted gold, eyes lined with kohl, not to weep, but to see clearly into the realm beyond. At the summit, the altar had been prepared. Musicians played flutes to drown out any sound that might come from beneath the stone in the hours ahead. When she reached the bottom, she turned once, looked up at her father, and smiled not in joy, but in something worse. In peace. A marble slab, veined like frozen lightning, was laid with the tools of consecration. The anointing blade, the book of ashes, and the ceremonial vial of blue sand harvested once every century from the mouth of the dry sea, where it was said the sun itself had bled. Nayari, veiled in white, was led by 6 temple maidens each, one silent, their hands trembling under the weight of tradition. Besetipi did. He stood at the head of the altar, his hands raised in blessing, his voice steady like a mountain crumbling in slow motion. Somewhere, a child asked if the gods had already heard her soul. Somewhere, a dog howled. Nayari knelt without being told. He dismissed the guards. Claimed communion. Brought only a single oil lamp and the book of ashes. His fingers trembled as he unsealed the edge of the resin, just enough to slip a thin reed tube into the tomb below. A simple tool. A coward's act? According to the rite, she would descend into the chamber of continuance, a sealed tomb, beneath the altar alongside only a torch, a carved tablet bearing her name, and a single papyrus scroll on which she could write her final prayer. But that was not the part that haunted Sin. Had the whole rite been built not by divine will, but by human fear of chaos? Was the second dawn merely a mechanism to control Tuko, to cleanse? No. What kept him awake at night was this. After the tomb was sealed, she would still live. Still, the ritual had to proceed. A tune she used to sing as a child, the one her mother taught her before she passed. Bahumman, it drifted up through the reed, like smoke, fragile and trembling, but unmistakably alive. Setipi raised the anointing blade knot to cut the tube lessened, whispered the final invocation. Nayari turned her face to the crowd. She did not cry. Then, slowly, solemnly, she descended the steps into the open tomb, carrying nothing but the scroll and the onyx scarab that hung around her neck. And there, between the cracked lines, he found something that had always been there yet never spoken aloud. The stone lid was placed over the entrance. Setipi did not blink. At sunset, the priests poured the blue sand around the edges, sealing it with sacred resin. The crowd roared approval. Offerings were thrown into the fire, wine, but Setipi did not move. He remained beside the tomb as the last light faded. The wind picked up, sharp and full of grit. Then, something broke. Not outside, inside him. That night, unable to bear the silence, Setipi returned to the altar alone. He whispered into it. At first, nothing, then a sound. Not a scream, not a sob. He fell to his knees. What kind of God demands this? He opened the book of ashes, turned to the forbidden page. When only read when doubt was louder than duty. The gods do not choose. The priests do. His hands dropped the scroll. The oil lamp flickered. Setipi's breath quickened. Was it possible? The humming had stopped. But if so, what of the signs? The dreams? The oracle's words? He stood, dazed. The wind outside screamed like a newborn. He looked again to the reed. And suddenly he knew. A sentence. This was no rite for the gods. This was a cage, and he was its warden. By the second night, the city had returned to its rhythm. Markets reopened. Acolytes sang their hymns, and the temple of the west wind stood silent, its newest tombstone warmed by the desert sun. To the people, the ritual was complete. The gods had been appeased. Balance restored. In the hours since, there had been no sound. He told himself she was meditating, praying, ascending. But his heart, traitorous and mortal, whispered the truth. She was dying. Within its brittle pages were the earliest records of Nekib's rites, older even than hieroglyphs. Slowly, in darkness alone, but for Setipi, time had fractured. But now, standing atop the sealed stone, he saw no threads connecting this act to heaven, only silence and stone, and the stench of ritual madness. He could still feel her voice trembling through the reed, echoing like a ghost in his chest. His ancestors, his entire priestly line, had not preserved sacred order. They had merely institutionalized a mistake, dressed it in silk, fed it, fig and song. His daughter was not ascending. She was repeating a crime, centuries old, wrapped in incense and lies. He carried tools, chisels, levers, water, a single oil lamp. And in his heart, only one purpose, to free her. Inch by inch, he pried it open. The blue sand hissed as it cracked. An ancient air seeped upward, dry, metallic, and heartbreakingly still. He had once believed sacrifice was sacred, that pain purified, that suffering stitched the city to the gods. In desperation, he turned to the scroll of the first voice in ancient text, sealed in cedar and blood, forbidden to all but the high priest himself. She had once been a woman, a healer, a midwife, executed for defying a pharaoh's decree. But finally, his feet touched the chamber floor. The lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the unmarked stone. She refused to let a noble child die in order to honor the stars. She had saved him, and for that, she was buried alive. And what he found shattered the very bones of his faith. There was no god named Nezemet, the deity said, to receive the buried offering. Nezemet was not divine, but something happened in the decades that followed. She clutched the onyx scarab still around her neck and pressed it into his hand. The harvests flourished. Rain returned, the city prospered, and so, the people, terrified of misfortune, began to repeat the crime each century, inventing a new divine name, layering myth over murder, until cruelty became sanctified, and blood became blessing. And when they emerged under the moonlight, the wind stopped utterly, eerily still, as if the gods themselves had paused to witness. Setapi collapsed as the truth flooded him. He could no longer be complicit. You buried Nesemet and called it God. You buried children and called it tradition. That night, he approached the tomb under cover of darkness, dressed not in his priestly robes, but in the plain linen of a pen. The resin seal was stubborn, but not invincible. He lowered the rope ladder into the darkness. Nyari, he whispered, I'm here. No reply. The descent was suffocating. Each rung felt heavier than the last. There she was, curled in a corner, pale as alabaster, her breath shallow, her lips cracked, but alive. When her eyes fluttered open and met his, something in him shattered, carrying with them the last scarab of Nezemet, and as somewhere beyond the dunes, they planted it in the sand. She didn't speak. She only wept, no sound, only tears. And then, slowly, her fingers reached for his. I dreamt, she whispered. Of what? Of a world where they buried no one. He carried her up, himself. Every step a prayer, every breath a defiance. But there was no time to flee. At the temple gate stood Tenet, chief scribe of the council, and behind him guards, priests, and torches. You desecrate the covenant, Tenet hissed. Setapi stood tall, cradling Nyari like an offering to the truth. There is no covenant, only repetition. Tenet's eyes burned, and yet the sun still rises, the rains still come. Not because of this, Setapi said. Despite it, a silence hung. Then the guards advanced. Setapi turned to Nyari. Run, he whispered, but she did not. Her hand gripped his, and together they stood, father and daughter, in defiance of history. What happened next remains uncertain. Some say the guards seized them both and buried them together as punishment, their tombs sealed and unmarked, forbidden to all. Others say the crowd, shaken by the truth, turned on the priests and burned the temple to ash, ending the rite forever. And if those who still hear whispers in the wind say that Setapi and Nyari vanished into the desert, and from that scarab grew a tree that no hand dare cut. The ancient Egyptian ritual that buried people centuries past. Nekheb was lost not to war, nor fire, nor the shifting course of the Nile, but to silence, the kind of silence that grows only over guilt, too old to name. Sand swallowed its spires, time cracked its obelisks. Cartouches bearing the names of its priests were scraped clean by trembling hands, a place where birds refused to sing, where beneath a lone acacia tree blackened, growing from stone lies, a tomb without a name, lips whispering, not curses, but questions. And beside her, a figure robed in linen, one hand clutching a scarab, the other holding hers. Even the gods once worshipped, there were abandoned, their effigies left to rot beneath dunes. No pharaoh ever spoke of it again. No scribe dared record its rites. But some things cannot be buried. Travelers, madmen, prophets, and fools speak of a place west of the White Cliffs where the wind never blows. They say, if you sleep near its roots, you dream not of yourself, but of her. Of Nyari, eyes open in darkness. They warned that Nezemet's wrath would follow them, that her spirit once silenced had awoken in Nyari and would never sleep again. The stone gods were placated with oil and praise, not people. Whether out of faith or fear, they changed. Quietly, entirely. They said she had become more than martyr, more than girl, that she had become the soul of reckoning, not cruel, but unforgiving. Mothers bore stillborn's dogs, howled at midday. Something in the land recoiled, as if the ancient pact had not been broken but betrayed. The story, as it reaches us now, is fragmented whispers in forgotten tongues, footnotes in scrolls, deliberately but certain truths pulse through the gaps. Setapi never returned to the priesthood. He had broken the chain of obedience that bound generations. Black bark, no leaves, no shadow. Whether he was killed, hidden, or simply walked into myth, we cannot say. It begins to whisper your name, not to threaten, but to ask. All we know is this. After that night, the festival of the second dawn was never performed again. But the cost? Oh, The cost was written not in ink, but in echo. The temples of Nekeb crumbled faster than stone ought to. Its crops failed in seasons of abundance. Some priests who survived fled to Thebes, others to Abydos. They told tales of a curse. If you see a black tree against the sun, walk carefully. Walk with reverence. And so, temples elsewhere adopted new rites, bloodless ones, symbolic offerings. Yet the question remains, was Seti right? Did he defy cruelty or damn the balance? There is no answer. Only the image of a father carrying his daughter from darkness, of a girl who smiled as she was buried, of a tree that grows where it should not, and walked away. Some say if you sit beneath that tree long enough, what would you have done? It's a fair question. Would you have followed the law, honored the gods, sealed the stone, kissed the forehead, or would you have listened to the trembling reed, the humming in the dark, the truth buried beneath the incense and gold? Most will never know. But if you ever feel the wind stop suddenly, if the silence around you turns dense, and watch and look to the horizon, because under its roots, the gods are still deciding who was right, and they are listening.